that, you can get,
Okay, I'm good to go.
you're good to go.
All right, let's pull up my. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here to present my some of my research and also just go into some background on salt marshes and threats that they're facing due to sea level rise. And so, as Joan said, my name is Andrew Payne. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Drexel University. And so I'll start out just giving a little bit about my life story here. Maybe not the whole life story, but the main points. So I grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York. And so I grew up, I spent a lot of time outdoors, and I think that's kind of what led me to pursue environmental studies as a major for my undergrad. So I went to SUNY Purchase College, which is just outside of New York City. And once I got my bachelor's degree, I moved to New York City for a little bit. I waited tables there for a couple of years and I tried a lot of different things. I tried making it as a musician for a little bit. That's a picture of me for when I was in my rock star days. For some reason, it didn't work out for me. Uh, just kidding. That's not actually me. So then I ended up getting a job after that with um, it was an environmental consulting firm, and we were doing fish entrainment and impingement studies at power plants around Long Island. So we were sampling for ichthyoplankton or like fish larvae and baby fish around the intakes for the plants to see like how these intakes where they suck in water to cool all their equipment were impacting the fish survival there. And so that was a temporary, like a summer job, and that led to my another job doing like wildlife management at JFK Airport for USDA. And so there we were trying to manage the birds, mostly bird populations, to try to reduce bird strikes at the airport. And after that, I got a job doing salt marsh bird surveys for sharp, which I think you guys had a speaker, Kate Ruskin, talking about that last
Yeah,
week.
right. Just last week.
Yeah. So I participated in that back in 2012, and I think that was what eventually led me to work in salt marshes. But before that, I got a job with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. This is one of my coworkers here doing a stream discharge measurement, just measuring the volume of water going down the stream in one of the tributaries for New York City. And so we were monitoring the streams as well as the reservoirs for the city water supply to make sure that all the regulations for the um, water quality parameters were met. And so, like I said, the previous job really gave me a love of salt marshes. I think I really enjoyed working in them. I found them to be peaceful habitats to be in, and as long as the bugs aren't biting too bad. And they're also very interesting to study. So I decided to go back to school for my master's degree at the University of New Hampshire. And so there I was working with David Burdick, and we studied how salt marshes were impacted by sea level rise. And so I did what's called a marsh organ experiment. You can see in this picture all these pipes that look like an organ. These are actually plant pots, and so I planted some different marsh plants, marsh grasses in these pots. And this is kind of late in the season. I think it was after I'd clipped the tops off a lot of them, so you can't really see the plants. But I had them growing in all the pots to see how the different flooding rates impacted their growth. And so we found that the lower pots the plants didn't do as well. They didn't produce as much above ground growth or below ground growth. And so that helped us to figure out how sea level rise could impact plant growth and in turn the marsh elevation change, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. So I figured I should start out for those of you that aren't familiar with salt marshes, just giving a background on what one is. I didn't really, growing up in Western New York, I didn't really know what one was until I had that job doing the bird surveys. So basically, they're inhabited by plants that are adapted to tolerate some salt and flooding stress, since they're flooded by tides, and they primarily occur in sheltered areas, which allows the sediments that are carried by the water to fall out of the water and be deposited on the marsh. And the plants sort of collect that sediment over time and can build an elevation. And so in this picture, you can see the tide flooding the marsh grasses here. This is the Spartina alterniflora, or the low marsh plant, which gets flooded pretty much with once a day with the tides. And a little bit more about that. In this picture, you can see it's a pretty clear divide between the Spartina alterniflora, or the new name for it is Sporobolus alterniflorus, but I'm going to stick to the old name for now, since that's what I'm used to. And so there's usually a pretty clear divide between the two plants. And the reason that is because this is kind of where the high tides tend to reach for each tide. And so the Spartina alterniflora is able to tolerate a greater degree of flooding than the Spartina patens, which occurs in this, what we call the high marsh. And that's that kind of cowlicky plant that's really beautiful when you look out at these nice marsh meadows. And it used to be harvested for salt marsh hay to feed cattle. Yeah, I'm not sure. They might still do that. I'm not sure in some places. And so salt marshes are very important for a lot of different ecosystem services. They're very productive habitats. You can see in this picture, there's this thick grasses and other types of plants, forbs and the shrubs that cover the marsh, and they produce a lot of biomass, and a lot of that gets stored in the ground in the peat, and peat is just a term for very organic soils. And so all that organic matter that's stored accumulates over time, which is important for carbon sequestration, so that carbon that's in the organic matter stays down in the marsh, doesn't degrade very quickly because there's not much oxygen there. And that can keep the carbon out of the atmosphere and help to prevent or slow down global warming. It's also important for habitat for different birds like the salt marsh sparrow, and invertebrates like the horseshoe crabs and a lot of other crab species will use the marsh. A lot of insects, dragonflies, spiders. Um, they're also important for protection from storms. They help to buffer the wave action during storms, and they can protect properties that are upland of the salt marshes by buffering these waves. They help with nutrient cycling, so they can take the nitrogen that's in the water that ends up in the ground, and because of the way salt marshes work, where sometimes they have oxygen, sometimes they're anoxic, that really helps to cycle the nitrogen through the system and can get it out of the water and back into the air, or be taken up by the plant. And my personal favorite is that they're really just great areas for recreation. They're really nice to kayak in. People go fishing, duck hunting, bird watching. A lot of outdoor activities can be done in the salt marsh, as long as you bring some bug spray. You'll be or wear long pants. Should be good. So unfortunately, salt marshes are under a lot of threats right now because of sea level rise. And so the rate of sea level rise has increased a lot over the last few decades. And so that can lead to plant death because they're only adapted to tolerate a certain amount of flooding. So if the flooding gets too much, the plants will die. And that can lead to marsh collapse and edge erosion. And we're seeing a lot of the creeks getting wider. As you can see in this picture to the right, here's a creek where a big piece of the marsh is kind of sloughed off into the creek. And eventually that will probably get eroded away, and all the carbon that was stored in this peat is going to end up back in the atmosphere, which is not ideal. And then also ponding is occurring in a lot of marshes. We're seeing the ponds getting bigger. So ponds in of themselves are not a bad thing because they can provide habitat for certain bird species and invertebrates. And the problem, though, is that the ponds are getting bigger, and so we're losing this vegetated area and seeing more of the ponds occurring. And lastly, we're seeing the Spartina alterniflora, which is the more flood tolerant plant, replacing the Spartina patens, which may be a problem for species that depend on patens, such as the salt marsh sparrow. Now, salt marshes, the good thing about salt marshes is that they can build in elevation over time. And they do that by accumulating organic matter through the plant growth. And so the roots keep growing, and they, like I said earlier, they kind of just stay in the soil and don't decompose very quickly. And so that keeps building up over time. And also the tides deposit sediment on the marsh. And also like ice flows and things like that can deposit sediment. So over time they're building up, but the problem is that they're not building up fast enough to meet the rate of sea level rise in a lot of cases. So this is a picture of me on the right measuring the elevation in the marsh using what's called a surface elevation table. And so for this method, you put a really deep rod down in the marsh, down to the ideally to the bedrock, but as far as you can get it. And then you that stays in the marsh. And when you want to measure it, you just hook up this device here with these pins that are lowered to the surface. And if you keep doing measurements over time, you can get really precise measurements of how quickly the marsh is building and see how many, usually it's a couple millimeters per year. And so you compare that to the rate of sea level rise to see if the marshes are keeping up or not. And this map on the left is from a report from the NERR, NERRs, and they found that most of the surface elevation tables are showing that the marshes are not keeping pace with sea level rise. Here's Waquoit Bay here, and you can see by the red, these are the number of SCTs or sets that are not showing a fast enough elevation change. So there are some ways that you can increase resilience of the marsh to sea level rise. And one of the tools that there's a lot of excitement about right now is runnels, which Joan mentioned. And in this picture, it's you can kind of see it. It's the idea is that you dig this small ditch that drains these pools, but you don't want to drain them too much, just the right amount to allow some vegetation to colonize these edges of the pools and for the pool to go up and down with the tides. And so if you want to learn more about that, you should come to the presentation. Is it next week? Next week, yeah. So that's one tool that we have. We can also do what's called thin layer placement, where you spray this slurry of water and sediment onto the marsh to try to build it up in elevation. And that's been done in Delaware. It's been done a lot in the Gulf Coast, not so much in New England, as far as I know.
Well,
Or you can,
it was done here too, but
oh, it was, okay.
in
Oh, good to know. Um, was that in those like in the boxes, or was it done over like a wider area?
the smaller
And
box.
in the experimentally.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I don't know of it being done on like a larger scale yet up there. But the other thing that you can do is to just build a marsh from scratch, basically, which is what we did in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in this picture, where we just we brought in all this sand. This used to be an area where it was all riprap, and so it wasn't very good habitat for anything except for Norway rats. And so we got rid of the riprap, pushed it out, put in sand, and had volunteers put plants all over it. And so these may be ways to help. The problem is that they're very expensive. In the case of the building the marsh and doing thin layer placement, unless you have to do dredging anyway, thin layer placement is not practical in a lot of areas. And we had a lot of issues with this marsh with it got destroyed several times from geese digging up all the plants. So it turned into a very expensive project because we had to keep bringing in more sediment and adding plants to it. And then the runnels could they do show some promise, and the only thing is we don't really know yet if there's going to be unintended consequences or not. Like if you end up draining them too much, it could cause the marsh elevation to subside. So that remains to be seen. And so, since these techniques are not always possible, and in most cases the marsh is not building an elevation fast enough, that leaves us with marsh migration as the main hope for marsh survival in the face of sea level rise. And in some areas, particularly in Chesapeake Bay um, and along the coastal plain, where there's flatter slopes, we're seeing these really large areas of tree dieback, which is outlined from the study from Kirwan and Geeden 2019. And so this whole area is all dead forest. They referred to it as ghost forest. And that's caused by sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, which kills the trees. And once the trees are killed, it allows for the marsh plants to colonize those areas. And in some cases, the area of marsh is actually expanding, and there's more marsh than there used to be because it's moving back that quickly over large areas. In New England, we don't see that quite as much. We don't really see these big areas of ghost forest, but we do see it along the edges of marshes. And you can see it at Sage Lot Pond at Waquoit Bay. And this picture here is showing a dead tree out in the marsh. And so you see a lot of these stumps along the edges. And so that was um, where the forest at some point ended and transitioned to marsh. And now that's moved back. And this process has been occurring for thousands of years. And you can see in this picture, this is from Wells Reserve, this really ancient tree stump that was along the beach here. And so what happened was this was covered with peat, and then there was a big storm, and all this got eroded and exposed this ancient tree. And so it's been happening for a long time. Now we're just seeing the rate of marsh migration increase because the rate of sea level rise is increasing. And in a lot of areas, there can be barriers to marsh migration. So things like roads or seawalls or dikes. And this diagram is showing a seawall kind of there's really no place for these plants to go because they can't get past the seawall. And same roads or dikes can do the same thing. And also steep slopes. So in New England, we have a lot of steep slopes relatively steep, bordering the marsh. And so if the marsh is going to move up this, it's going to do so very slowly. Whereas if it was flat, it could just move back and spread over a larger area. And the other problem is invasive species like Phragmites australis, which is represented by this taller plant here. So that can slow down migration too because it's a very strong plant and it can resist sea level rise. So there are some issues with marsh migration that could be addressed. And so a lot of people have studied this overall rate of migration and seeing how quickly it's moving back, but not not too many people have looked at what types of plants, what plant communities are occurring in these areas. So for my research project, I wanted to go in and look at what kind of plant species are there and figure out what type of environmental variables are determining which plant species are occurring and what their abundances are. And so I also wanted to compare the physical characteristics of my different sites by looking at the slope and the depth of the water table. So this map is showing the three sites that I looked at for my research. The Massachusetts one is at Waquoit Bay and Sagelot Pond in this area. And the New York site is on Eastern Long Island at Pine Neck Preserve in East Quogue. And my New Jersey site is in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. So it's down near Ocean City, New Jersey is probably the closest. So to figure out what types of plant species were living in these different areas, and what for the rest of the talk, I'll just refer to them as marsh forest ecotones. And ecotone is just a border between two types of habitats. And so these are areas that are transitioning currently. So in the marsh forest ecotone, we used quadrats, which is these square PVC pipe shapes. And then we documented the percent cover of the different types of vegetation within these quadrats. And we also collected soil cores from the quadrats to measure the soil moisture, the organic matter content, and the salinity. And we also measured the light availability at these different plots because marshes um, are used to having the marsh plants are used to full light. So we figured that may be an issue for the marsh plants that are trying to migrate into the upland areas because the trees and the phragmites and shrubs and everything can block out the light. So we measured the light availability. That's what Calvin Keyes at Drexel undergrad is doing here. And then to look at the water table depth, we put groundwater wells going from the marsh into the forest. And so this diagram is showing what the well looks like. It's pretty simple, really just a PVC pipe with holes in it. And then you put this water level logger, and some of them we put conductivity loggers in as well to measure the conductivity or salinity. And this picture here, you can see this is what the logger looks like. And there's the well top that you just tie it to a string and then put it in there. So we had those wells in along the marsh forest ecotone. And we also measured the slope of the ecotone using a really accurate GPS. And we did static measurements where you just leave the GPS there for like half an hour. So you get some really accurate measurements of elevation. So for the results, we found a lot of different types of plant species occurring in these areas. And you can see in this photo, it's really dense. It's very hard to walk around in here. And if any of you have hiked around Waquoit Bay on the trails there, you've probably seen these thick shrubs. And there's also these prickly vines mixed in and a lot of ticks, not so much at Waquoit Bay, but at my other sites, you'd just walk out of there covered in ticks. So we end up having to wear waders when we were doing these surveys to protect our bodies from the thorns and the ticks, which got very hot. But it was cool being back in these areas because they're just places that people don't generally go. And so I wanted to go through some of the different plant species that we found. And so you can, next time you're out hiking around, you can point these out to your friends and show off your naturalist skills. This is marsh elder, which is Iva frutescens, or some people call it the high tide bush, and that occurs more. We found that it was generally lower along the marsh forest ecotone, like at the very upland border of the salt marsh. And of course, there's the common reed, Phragmites australis. That tends to be the most dominant marsh forest ecotone species. And so we found that it was very dominant, almost a monoculture at our New Jersey site. At Waquoit Bay, there was more of a mixture, and the same with our New York site. But it isn't the variety that we tend to see is invasive, although occasionally you can find the native variety, like at the Great Bay NER or New Hampshire, they have some of it. There's also the groundsel tree, Baccharis elimifolia, and that looks kind of similar to Iva, except that it has alternate leaves instead of opposite leaves, and it has these nice white flowers that come out in the fall. And there's a lot of this plant, the greenbrier or smilax, which has these horrible thorns on it, and you get tangled up in it. It's really awful. But it does have berries on it. It serves an important wildlife food source. And there's inkberry, Ilex glabra. You'll see this kind of that's all over the around the trails at Waquoit Bay. And it has berries on it, but they are toxic to humans, but they're very good for birds. And it's a nice evergreen plant, kind of waxy leaves. A lot of people plant it in their gardens, and it's used in restoration a lot as well. We found black huckleberry, and this, unlike the inkberry, these berries are edible, and they're pretty tasty. They have larger seeds than blueberries, but as long as you don't mind that, they're very good to eat. And of course, there's trees as well. So it's the marsh forest ecotone is a mixture of trees and marsh plants. So this was taken from the viewing platform at the Sage Lot Pond in Waquoit Bay. And so probably some of you have been to this area and looked out at this mixture of trees and Phragmites. But we found that the tree species tends to vary with elevation similarly to the marsh plants. So lower in the marsh forest ecotone, you would see more of these eastern red cedars, and then as you go up, there's more pitch pines. And further back into the forest, there's a lot of oaks, like this white oak shown here, and a lot of black gum, as well as there's other trees too that, such as the red maple, um, that you might see in these areas. But these are the main ones that we found. So we took all the data that we had on the different plant species that we found and the environmental variables, and then we put them into statistical models and tried out a bunch of different variables to see what gave us the best model and what had the highest accuracy at predicting the presence or absence of salt marsh plants. And so we found that salinity, flooding time, and light availability were the most important variables in these models. And we also tried models where just elevation was used, and we found that didn't really do a great job at predicting whether there was going to be salt marsh plants there or not. And we also found that site had a important effect on the types of plants that were there. So there were different plants at different sites. And another thing that we did was we mapped the tree line from aerial imagery at the different sites. And so these are just photographs taken from an airplane, which you can get pretty good resolution on those. And so that allowed me to just map out the edge of the forest. And so this blue line is showing where the edge of the forest, like the lowest boundary of tree species that were still alive. And the pink line, I got that for by just walking along the upper edge of the salt marsh plants. So this is kind of the overlap in between these two lines where the marsh forest ecotone is occurring. And so we compared the elevations of these lines between the three different sites. And what we found was that the lower boundary of trees at the New Jersey site was much closer to mean high water. You can kind of see in this graph here, the pink, that's showing the elevations of the tree line. It's a lot lower compared to mean high water, which is where the average high tide reaches, than at the other sites. So that seems to suggest that the trees at the New Jersey site are able to withstand a greater frequency of tidal flooding than at the other two sites. And so the ability of trees to withstand tidal flooding could depend on multiple different factors, but I think salinity is probably a likely one since our other models showed that salinity was important. And also the New Jersey site has the lowest salinity of any of the sites because it is along a big river um, in an estuary, and it's farther away from the ocean than the New Jersey and Waquoit Bay sites. So the lower salinity might allow the trees to exist lower in the tidal frame and withstand a greater frequency of tidal flooding. And so for our water table measurements that we got from the wells and slope measurements of the land, we found the slopes of Waquoit Bay and the New York site were relatively similar. You could see the slope in the green lines here. They also had a similar depth to the water table, which is the blue line. But the New Jersey site was much different. It had much lower slope, and the water table level was almost at the surface, even where these living trees were found. So you would think that would cause the rate of marsh migration to be higher at the New Jersey site. And I'm not sure if that is true or not, but because there's other factors like salinity, which may result in a slower rate at the New Jersey site. And then in the wells, we also had these conductivity loggers, which conductivity is basically like a proxy for salinity. And so we measured a couple different storm surges that occurred last winter. In January, the New York site got hit with three different big storms. And in fact, one of the storm surges was the largest they'd had since Hurricane Sandy. And so this well was right at the edge of I'd say the upper boundary of the salt marsh ecotone. So it was all fall. It was pretty flat, and then it got hit. So you can see the conductivity went all the way up to 30 millisiemens per centimeter, which is a salinity of probably, I would guess, around 18 parts per thousand or something like that. And so then it quickly dropped off, but then it got hit again. And this time it really dropped off quickly, probably because we got a lot of rain during that storm. And so that appears to contrast with the New Jersey site, which got hit by a storm surge in the fall and just had this really gradual decline. And unfortunately, Waquoit Bay I had some issues with rodents chewing my cable at the logger that I had installed there. So I have most of the data, but it kind of got messed up. So I'm currently working on that. But it looked like one of these storms did hit the Waquoit Bay site as well in January. Probably you guys know more about that than me. So the main takeaways from my research were that light availability and salinity are also important in addition to elevation or flooding frequency. So these should be factored in when designing restoration projects. And also, different plant species seem to benefit from marsh migration in different areas. Like I said, the New Jersey site, it's primarily made up of Phragmites. So that seems to be the main plant that's benefiting from marsh migration and will likely expand at that site. Whereas Waquoit Bay and the Pine Neck sites, maybe it has something to do with the salinity, but they have a wider variety of plants in the ecotone. And then we also found that slope and depth to the water table varied by site. And so that may have implications for how quickly salt marsh migration into the forests can occur there. So, what can we do about this? One of the things that people are talking about now is assisted migration. And so that's kind of just looking into ways to help the marsh migrate into the forest and just kind of speed up the overall process as well as allowing the marsh to move back by removing barriers. Um, but it's sort of a controversial subject because, forests also provide a lot of important ecosystem services. So in some cases, depending on what species are in the forest, you may value the forest over the salt marsh. But in a lot of cases, we have a lot of forests and we're losing salt marshes. So people are starting to prioritize this marsh migration into the forested areas. And so one thing that we could try doing is ditch remediation. So there's a lot of these mosquito ditches that were dug back in the 30s along the marsh. Some of them go close to the forest edge. So possibly if you started to partially fill in some of the ditches slowly, you might end up speeding the overall process of marsh migration because the forests aren't going to be drained as quickly after they're flooded by these storm surges. And that you can kind of see from that New Jersey site that I showed you where the conductivity slowly decreased after the storm surge. And that site, it has the forested area is the farthest away from any ditches. So that could be a correlation there. We don't know yet. I'm still kind of looking into that. But ditch remediation could help. We could also try to thin some of the trees along the edge or maybe even clear cutting the forests, which is what they tried in at least one area to kind of a limited degree of success. They cleared the forest and then it ended up just forest plants recolonized, but it might be because the elevation wasn't right. So that is something that could be looked into, but again, that involves destroying the forest habitat. And then one small thing that people can do to help is to just try to avoid mowing the marsh. So if the marsh plants are starting to encroach on your lawn, if you don't mind giving up some of your lawn, just kind of let them move back. That can allow the marsh to migrate as well. So yeah, with that, I'd like to thank my advisor Beth Watson, who's at Stony Brook University, my family, for their support, my committee member, and also Megan and everyone at Waquoit Bay NERR, and the undergrads who helped me in the field. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Great. If you want to, well, I think you can close your presentation unless somebody wants refers to any of the slides, and then we can see you. We can highlight you, and Lori and I will take turns reading some questions from the chat box. I forgot to mention to people if you can just type in your questions in the chat box. Lori and I will read them to Andrew. So you can do that now. You want to do the
Okay,
first
thanks.
one, Lori?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Looks like we have a couple questions, and I'll start off with David. Are ecological economics research tools being utilized in this project to evaluate natural capitals and ecosystem services and salt marshes that are impacted by climate change?
That's a good question. I haven't done anything with environmental economics really, but that would be that, yeah, that could help to evaluate whether it's, you prioritize the salt marsh versus the forest, I guess, when you're doing these management practices. But no, I haven't involved that with my project.
Okay. Let's see. Next question is, oops, wait a minute, I skipped one here. Is ponding the same as a salt pan?
I would say no, that I wouldn't consider them the same because ponding to me means that it's not vegetated. So the water is too deep in a pond for the plants to live there, where salt pans, I consider salt pans to be like they might be a little bit lower in elevation or where the water doesn't drain as well, but you still have plants growing there, like especially forbs or maybe some short form Spartina alterniflora.
Could you also explain the difference between a mosquito ditch and a runnel?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Mosquito ditches they're a lot deeper, but
Hmm.
that is it. Yeah, a lot of people we've been complaining about this ditches for decades. So now we're talking about digging our own ditches in the marsh again. So it's like it's kind of a tricky subject there, but yeah, the mosquito ditches were dug in the 30s to try to drain the marsh to control mosquitoes, but they didn't really work very well. And so the idea is to do it to try to keep the ditch shallow enough that it won't fully drain the pond, but just enough that it'll go up. The water elevation will move up and down with the tides.
All right,
Thank you.
The next question, are there strategies that can help Phragmites out when you've got an area where you are encouraging marsh migration? Sure.
Okay, so yeah, to help control the Phragmites.
I'm not sure. Vicky, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify, like, are you saying you want to help the Phragmites?
Yeah, yeah. The words are kind of messed up there. It should be strategies that can help keep Phragmites out. If you're encouraging marsh migration in an area, but don't want to end up with a field of Phragmites.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's Phragmites is very difficult to control, it seems like. You might be able to, I mean, there's always you can use herbicides to control it, which is what people do in a lot of places, but that has its own environmental consequences. And it seems like it doesn't, you kind of have to keep applying it or the Phragmites will just come back. Um, and I know they've tried a lot of things like burning the Phragmites. Um, or I wondered too if I mentioned the ditch remediation, and I wonder if that would have any impact on it too, because if you partially filled in the ditches, that could cause the salinity to be higher, and Phragmites is not able to tolerate salinity as well as a lot of the native marsh plants. So that could have an effect, but yeah, it's tough to say. That's definitely a risk with if you're encouraging migration that you might also encourage the spread of Phragmites.
Okay, we have another question. I believe a Kerwin paper mentioned how the transition from ghost forest to marshland can take around 1 to 2 decades. How does this rate compare in New England with steeper slopes?
Yeah, thanks, Sixto. That's a good question. I think in New England, I would guess that it would take longer. They haven't really, there's been a few papers that have measured the rates of marsh migration in New England, and One was done at the Great Marsh in Massachusetts, and they found there that there was very little marsh migration occurring because of the steep slopes. So yeah, that would probably take longer than 1 to 2 decades in some places there. And there's another paper where I'm not sure if they measured the rate of migration, but it was a Holmquist paper where they looked at the elevations along the slopes along the edge of the marsh. And they did find that New England overall had higher slopes than most of the East Coast. And so they were estimating the rate of marsh migration as being much slower there. But yeah, they didn't measure an exact rate.
Okay. How are ditches filled in?
Well, they've tried they for a while there they were trying to just plug the ditches, and that didn't really work because it just caused the too much flooding to occur too quickly, and the plants weren't able to adapt, and they kind of most of the plants along the ditches just died. And so now what David Burdick and some of the other people at UNH and at the trustees of Massachusetts have been doing a project where been they clip the grasses along the ditches, and they kind of stake that down into the ditch in the bottom. And so that allows the ditch to keep draining, but it slows it down. And then over time, all that above ground material, all the grasses that you put down in the ditch will trap the sediment. And so that should slowly fill in the ditches. And that way the process takes a lot longer. And so the plants can kind of adapt to it better. That's the idea anyway. I don't know if I'm not sure how, if there's any long-term studies showing how successful it is, but that's the technique that most people are using now.
Okay.
I have one more question here. You touched upon this a little bit already. Can you speak about the speed of the transition over time? And can you give an example perhaps about how quickly this transitioning might be happening specifically at Waquoit Bay?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure that out myself. Just a minute, let me show you a slide that I thought this question might come up, so I included it on the slide, but I don't have anything conclusive to say about that, about the rate. But I did try mapping the forest change at Waquoit Bay. And so I made this figure here showing I just, it's kind of a crude way to do it, but I drew a line along the tree boundary with the forest in imagery from 2003 and 2023. So 2003 is the purple line,
Mm-hmm.
and 2023 is the black line. So the change is relatively small at Waquoit Bay, um, as far as I can tell. But the imagery from 2003 is kind of poor quality, so that's why I didn't want to say conclusively give any numbers for the rates, because it's kind of hard to draw to see this. From 2023, you can pretty clearly see where the line is, but the 2003 image is not as good. And so, but it looks like in some areas this was a pretty clear area. This is where we had some of our groundwater wells, and you can see it's transitioning when you're there. Um, and it was about a 10-meter change when I measured this distance between the two lines, and that was 10 meters over 20 years.
Hmm.
So that is relatively fast, I'd say, in that area. But then other areas, it doesn't seem to have changed much at all. Um, but yeah, that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to get a better handle on that. In places where it's occurring more quickly, like in Chesapeake Bay, they're using Landsat imagery, which has a very poor resolution of like 30 meters is the size of each pixel. So they're able to see, since the rates are much faster there, they're able to use poorer resolution imagery to determine the rates, because they'll have those huge areas that are changing. But in New England, since it's not as fast, you need higher resolution imagery to really get an accurate estimate.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see. There's a couple of comments. One was that Jeff Donnelly core studies seem to indicate hurricanes brought in large quantities of sand onto the marsh and raised heights. And then from Megan, Beth Watson told us we have very salty forests. Did you just ask that question, Lori?
No, go ahead. No, that's
Okay.
you.
Can you tell us more about it or show us some of the data on it again? So did you hear that one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that area by that viewing platform at the Sage Lot Pond, where we have one of our conductivity wells, had pretty high conductivities that we measured, and I wish the data looked better. I wanted to show it, but since I had that issue with the rodents chewing my cables, the elevations got messed up of the sensor, and I have to go and try to correct it now. I could try to let me just see what it looks like if I could pull it up. But that area did get to be pretty high salinity. It pretty regularly would, like with the spring tides, would get up to around 30 millisiemens per centimeter. So like, 15 parts per thousand or something like that. And there's not a lot of trees there, but the eastern red cedars they seem to be able to withstand it um, pretty well. Let me see if I can just look at this figure here. Yeah, it doesn't. I don't know if it's worth showing the figure, but yeah, it does get up to around 30 or so. And I'd be happy to, once I get it sorted out more, I can send it to you.
All right. I think that's all we have for questions that I'm seeing. So, and it looks like you brought us right to almost 7:30.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And also, I want to invite everybody to come next week, whether it be by webinar or if you want to come in person to the reserve. So we'll see you next week. And thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.